Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Coffee and Tea with Marquines.
Cheers.
My name is Maria, and this is the perfect moment for you to grab a cup of your favorite drink and spend a little bit of time with us discussing Digging for Water. That's today's title.
Digging for water.
So you want to start?
So what does digging for
What?
water have anything to do
With art.
with art? Well, there is a connection. In working with a lot of artists, both at the college level as well as here privately, one of the things that I inevitably do is discuss their work, where it's going, how they're doing, their studio practice, and so on. And oftentimes what comes up in these conversations with other artists is the fact that for many artists, they don't really have a sense of what they're doing from week to week.
Like a plan, you mean?
Not just a plan. What I hear a lot of, Maria, is artists will say, you know what, on Monday I'm doing X, and on Wednesday I'm doing something else, and then a few days later I'm over here. In other words, for a lot of folks, they're directionless, is another way of putting it. They don't have a constant in their practice. In other words, they're all over the place.
In terms of subject, in terms of medium, or all of it?
All of it.
Okay. So experimenting.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, we want to experiment. Like the studio can definitely be a laboratory. I consider mine that. But that's different from week to week, not having a sense of settling in, and really staying with an idea or tools and materials for a length of time. And again, there's this balance between, on the one hand, experimenting with possible avenues of exploration, and on the other hand, or the other end of the spectrum, really being kind of aimless and just being all over the place, scattered, if you will.
That sounds bad.
It can be, and for some artists, it can be not just bad, Maria, it can be debilitating to the point where they just kind of want to give up because they just don't know how to stay focused and stay with an idea or a concept or a
Is this
direction.
something that is more in connection with, let's say, beginners, or do also advanced artists have this problem issue?
I would say that for most advanced artists, professionals, it's less of a problem. If you look at the history of a lot of artists going all the way back, and even right now, the artists who have really been at this for quite some time, and if you look at their work, it goes through stages.
Right.
That's inevitable. Now, some artists will stay with the same idea and the same style for years on end. You look at Miranda, for instance. But for a great many artists, you can see a development that is over a period of time in which they go through phases. But they stick with an idea or a concept or a way of working for quite some time, and inevitably, organically, it might take them somewhere else. There's transformation. But I'm not talking, I am talking about that. That seems natural, organic, and worthwhile. What is problematic for a lot of artists, and yes, sometimes even people who've been at it for a while, is not having a sense of really a stick-to-itness. Just use that phrase, a stick-to-itness. So here's the analogy that I offer up for these folks, and immediately, once I explain the analogy, the story, if you will, they get it. They say, that's me. So here's the analogy, digging for water. So we have to imagine ourselves as pioneers, going back to a time where rugged work was happening on the farm, if you will. And that if you wanted water, you'd have to dig for a well. And if you were poor, you would do it yourself. And so let's imagine, theoretically, that you're that farmer, and you go out on your back 40 and you decide on a given weekend you want to start to dig for water. It's imperative that you hit water. Well, in those days, they had what was called a dowel, which was a forked piece of wood that was like a Y shape, and most of you all out there would probably heard this fable wives' tale. And people who believed in this believed there was a power to that. And that psychically they could go out with a dowser, it was called, I think a dowser was what it was called, and say, oh yes, this is the spot. The dowser would lead them to a spot. So you're there with your dowser and shovel, and this seems to be the spot. Great, here we go. And you dig for an hour or so. And you get a shallow hole about this deep. And then you think to yourself, no, this doesn't feel right. Let me try again. So now you're again with the dowser. You move a few feet over and, this feels better. Great, this is the spot. So again, you dig for about an hour or so. And you think, no, this doesn't feel right either. Well, guess what? You do this all weekend long. Can you imagine? All weekend long, you're doing this with the dowser and the shovel, and what you've got at the end of the weekend are a whole bunch of really shallow holes. I mean,
no water.
Obviously no water. You never went past a foot or two. And the back lot is riddled with shallow holes. Well, there's very little, in fact, there's no chance at all of hitting water. So the next weekend you decide, you know what? This time I'm going to use that dowser again, but I'm really going to connect with my psyche. I'm going to figure out the spot, and when it feels right, I'm going to dig, and I'm going to stay at this spot, and I'm going to dig deep. And this is what happens. You bring out the dowser, you find the spot that feels right, and you dig, and you dig, and you dig. You dig so much that at some point the hole is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. You dig so much, Marija, that you need a post hole digger to get out the dirt, and eventually you might even need a ladder to get in and out of this deep hole that you have stayed with all weekend long. Well, the chances of hitting water now are very good, if not excellent, you see, because you stayed in one spot and you just kept digging. This is what yields fruit, if you will. This is what yields results. And this is what yields for the artist a deeper understanding of what they're doing and where they want to go with the work. The work always takes us somewhere. But if we're in one place on Monday and a completely different place on Wednesday and somewhere else completely different on Friday, and then Sunday we're somewhere else in our practice, well, yes, there's lots of experimentation going on, and that can yield amount of fruit, if you will. But to do this week in and week out and week in and week out, there's no way that an artist is going to, quote, hit water.
Does this have to do a little bit with the style, what we call developing your own style? Does staying in that one place for a longer period of time help develop a style?
If one associates style with a way of looking at things and a way of expressing that way of looking, then yes. And this is true, I think, for all the arts. A musician, a writer, they're in the same boat. You know, a musician is only going to hammer out a piece if he or she is working on that piece over and over and over again, working through all the mistakes, the missteps, even the failures. Of course, they're going to, quote, hit water at some point. A writer who's working on either a short poem, a short story, or even a novel has to stick with it. There's another analogy, Marija, I like to use, which is very similar, and that is a miner mining for gold. A miner, let's say the 49ers back in the day, they go into a cave, they see a vein of gold, and they get excited, and they go, wow, this is great. Well, they mine that vein until it runs out. And when that vein of gold runs out, it's done. And it's time to look for another vein. I think our studio practice can be similar. And then this relates to what we are talking about, artists whose work goes through stages and phases. They're mining a vein that is productive, worthwhile, exciting, adventurous, and then organically, that vein can run out.
I remember from my own experience that I tasted both. I do remember having these phases where I would jump around and trying to figure things out, but I also remember experiences where I would stick with a certain thing for a longer time and the feelings that I would have with that, which was pretty rewarding, I must say. Especially in art school, you know, you taste and you try all kinds of techniques from mosaic to painting. But I also remember giving myself an assignment. For example, I remember particularly, I told myself, okay, I'm going to draw and paint this one apple. It was just one apple. And then I did it with just a bottle. And I would try different techniques, but with a very simple and constant subject matter. Or I would tell myself, okay, what can I do with one pencil? Or what can I do with just painting with black and yellow? That's it. What can I do with that? And just staying with it. And it was really rewarding because I would discover that I can do so much more than I thought I could. So I don't know if you think that personality also has to do something with that, like people who are curious and want to try everything and don't settle in quite easily. Is that a thing of a character as well as maybe beginner versus more advanced artists?
I think that's a factor, not the only factor, but it is a factor. So here's the deal. It's not what you look at, Marija. It's how you look at it. That's the key. Or in your imagination, if you're not working from observation, it's still the same thing. You're working with design, composition, etc. So it's what holds our interest for a long period of time. That's what's going to get us to that deep hole that has water in it.
So for those artists who maybe recognize themselves in this talk, could we say, first of all, that there is no right and wrong in the approach, that both have their benefits?
Absolutely.
The one of research and experimentation to, just try out different things and broaden your horizons.
Yes.
But then there is also something to be said about, okay, let me at some point stop, reflect, choose one, and stay with it and see where it takes me organically, more naturally.
Very much. Well said. And in fact, Marija, this wall behind us is filled with experimentations of my own. I'm figuring out how to teach the language of design. And I stuck with graphic work. I said, okay, no color. And I stuck with dry and wet materials in terms of tools. That was the constant. Then all these various designs are experimentations, but even then, I very slowly went from one idea to the next, and then one idea took me to another idea, which took me to another idea. But I stayed in a relatively narrow framework, and that's the key, of parameters. And that's the key also for those of you who are listening and going,
simplify and give yourself some parameters, some boundaries.
Give yourself parameters and boundaries, Marija. It makes all the difference in the world. If you know going into the studio that you're going to keep your parameters fairly narrow and can stay within those parameters, inevitably it'll take you somewhere else. But it won't take you from here all the way to here, all the way to here. You'll go from here to here to there.
So this ties up a little bit on what we talked about in our previous episode, and that was challenges or obstacles or problem solving. And I think that maybe giving ourselves a little bit of a challenge, dipping into the territory where we feel a little bit uncomfortable, and discovering where that can take us could be a way of dealing with this dilemma. So just to kind of repeat and sum this would be to, if you're recognizing yourself as one of these researchers and adventurers, to stay there for a little bit, because that's totally okay, but then at some point give yourself a different task, and that is to stop, reflect, simplify, give yourself some boundaries and parameters, and see what you can do and what you can discover in that little world, in that little patch of a much bigger world.
Well said. Yeah.
Okay. Anything else you want to share just to wrap it up?
Well, you know, I'm thinking about this. For my birthday, I got myself a musical instrument, and it's a big steel drum, and it's absolutely beautiful. But it's a complex instrument, and so I've been trying to learn how to play it. And in looking at the videos, one of the best videos says, keep it simple in the beginning. And they just said, what happens if you just go beam, bum, 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 beam, bum, bum, bum. Pretty soon you can add a note or two, and that's opened up for me a beautiful room. So when you enter into a room, keep it simple. And it will take you to all corners of that room. That's another way of saying it. And that would be my advice, is to keep it simple in the beginning and see where it takes you.
Well, that sounds good to me. I know it has benefited me as well as a young artist, but also as, for example, a yoga practitioner. You know, don't go left and right, or if you do and you get a little overwhelmed and lost, come back to the basics. Just come back to what's the beginning, the step 1, 2, 3.
And I think the other last thing I'd like to say is, I think what people struggle with, Maria, is this idea of boredom. They start something and they get bored. That's sometimes, frankly, a lack of imagination as to what's possible. So the way to get through boredom is to stay with it and see where it takes you. That's also an issue.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Don't get bored.
Don't get bored. Try not to get bored.
Keep it interesting. Keep it fun, even if it's simple. And let us know if this is your struggle. Let us know if you recognize yourself in this little discussion. Have you tried to dig for water deeper?
Or suggestions of people who have
Yes.
gotten through this.
Totally.
Like, what's worked for you?
Yeah, we love hearing from you. So thank you for sticking with us for another coffee and tea, and we'll see you next month.
All right. Ciao.